Hey, welcome everybody. Great to have you guys here today. I can't think of a better way to end one week and begin a new week than to be here with God's people. My hope and my prayer is that God will speak to your heart in a very personal, very powerful way in this time that we spend together. And let me give a big shout out to those of you who are joining us online right now. Great to have you guys with us as well. Let me encourage you, if you live within a 20-minute drive of one of our 3 locations, we'd love to have you join us in person. If that's not possible for you, let me encourage you to invite others to wherever it is that you watch and make a viewing party of it. But for those of us who are here in the room, let's welcome those who are watching online. Great to have them with us as well. Well, throughout the month of November here at Parker Hill, we've been focusing on one word, and that is the word grace. And grace is a word that most people have heard, but I've discovered that, on the other hand, it's a word that most people don't really understand or truly appreciate. And so we're spending 4 weeks just trying to wrap our minds around and wrap our hearts around grace, what it is, why it matters, why it is the ultimate game changer in our lives. And so let me begin again this week with a definition. Here's kind of a technical, theological definition of grace. Grace is the unmerited favor of God. It is God's favor, His blessing, His forgiveness, His love poured out on people who do not deserve it. God's grace cannot be earned or purchased. It is simply a gift that is given to us that is undeserved and oftentimes unexpected. I was reading a news story last year that I thought was a beautiful picture of grace. It was the story of a 20-year-old guy by the name of Hunter. And Hunter had to fly to Las Vegas for his sister's wedding. But after he got there, he discovered that he had lost his wallet somewhere along the way. And he had $60 in cash in his wallet, along with his most recent paycheck and, of course, his driver's license. And so he was pretty upset that he had lost his wallet, but it was his sister's wedding weekend, so he didn't make a big deal about it. Just borrowed some money from his parents and got through the weekend. But a day or two after he got back home to South Dakota, a package arrived in the mail, and in the package was his wallet with everything, including the $60 in cash, still in it. And along with the wallet in that package was a note. And the note said this: Hunter, found this on a Frontier flight from Omaha to Denver, row 12, seat F, wedged between the seat and the wall. Thought you might want it back. All the best, TB. They later discovered through Facebook that the guy that sent it back to him was named Todd Brown from Omaha. But then there was a PS. Here's the PS. I rounded up your cash to an even $100 so you could celebrate getting your wallet back. Have fun. Like that right there, that is grace. That's being given something you could not earn and do not deserve even when you've messed up. And grace is a game changer. So this month, as we talk about grace, we as a church also want to give our community a clear picture of grace. And so that's why we've been talking about this project called Best Foot Forward. Our hope is that we can send a message to students and families in our community that there is a church in northeastern Pennsylvania that cares about them. And more importantly, there is a God who cares about them. And so our goal is to purchase a brand new pair of shoes or boots for every student in 3 different elementary schools near our 3 different campuses. And by the way, these are name brand Adidas shoes or Skechers boots. They are like legit, they are nice, and we'd love you to be a part of this, and here's why. Because as we move into the Christmas season, our thoughts turn to giving. But here's what I've discovered. Most of our giving at Christmas time is gifts that we give to people that we know and people that we love. And that's good. But I think the best reflection of the true Christmas spirit and the best reflection of God's grace and God's heart is when we give to people that we don't know and may never meet and people that cannot reciprocate our giving. That's grace. And that's what this is all about. So whether you're here, whether you're watching online, we'd love to have you participate with us. Grab that envelope that was on your seat. You can help us show our community what grace looks like. You can either give using the actual envelope or just follow the instructions on the envelope that will tell you how to give online, okay? So I'd love you to be a part of that. So let's jump in. Let's talk about grace. And throughout this series, there's a symbol that you're going to be seeing over and over again. It's the math symbol that means greater than. And so every week, over these 4 weeks, we've been filling in the blank on a particular statement. Grace is greater than, and then we fill in the blank every single week. Grace is greater than something, okay? And so we want you to have a picture of that phrase in front of you, and so there's a card we'd like to give you. And if you're seated in the outside end chairs by the wall, reach underneath your chair, or if you're near there and you can scoot over, there's a white bucket under there, and there's a $20 bill in the bucket. Just kidding. There's a bunch of these cards in the bucket. Just take them and pass them right down your row so that everybody gets one, okay? So you can have this in front of you. Grace is greater than, and we'll fill in the blank in just a minute. But let me do a little bit of review while you're passing out those cards. Last week we talked about this statement: grace is greater than my sin. And this is a very, very important concept to understand, because in today's world, if you were to just randomly ask people, what does it mean to have a relationship with God? What does it take to be in heaven someday? The vast majority of people would say something like this: as long as my good deeds are greater than my bad deeds, I'm in. God is cool with me. In other words, good people go to heaven. And so we talked about this concept last week, and we talked about the fact that this is not at all what the Bible says. This is just not true. In fact, the prophet Isaiah says this. Listen to this. Isaiah 64. All of us, that means all of us have become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous acts are like filthy rags, which is interesting. Not our unrighteous acts are like filthy rags, but even our best efforts at being good amount to little more than filthy rags. It's kind of like this. Imagine you leave here today and you stop at Burger King on the way home for lunch, and you get the double Whopper with extra cheese and extra mayonnaise, and you get the large order of fries and the large order of onion rings and 2 apple pies for dessert, and then you get a Diet Coke to cancel that all out, right? Okay, newsflash, the Diet Coke does not cancel out all the bad stuff that you just ate at Burger King. And that's the way some of us think about faith and about spirituality, that the little good things that we do can somehow cancel out our brokenness and our rebellion and our failure and our sin. And so what we talked about last week was the fact that the only thing that can counterbalance our sin is God's grace. God's grace is greater than our sin, no matter what our sin may be. So if you missed last week's message, you can go online and get caught up. But today we're talking about not what it means to receive grace, but what it means to extend grace to other people. Not just grace flowing into us, but grace flowing through us. And specifically, we're talking about giving grace to people who have hurt us, made our lives difficult in some way, shape, or form. And see, this is where grace gets a little bit messy, because we like talking about God's grace being given to us when we fail. But when we talk about giving grace to other people who have failed us, that's a little bit more difficult. I mean, grace is a beautiful thing to talk about, unless we're talking about giving grace to the father who berated you, or the boss who fired you, or the relative who abused you, or the spouse who walked away from you. We love talking about grace until it comes to giving grace to people who've made our lives difficult. Because here's the truth. Our natural response when somebody hurts us, when somebody offends us, our natural response is not to show grace. Our human natural response is to hold on to that hurt, to become bitter, and just to kind of sit back and wait for them to get what's coming to them. Kind of like this letter that a guy wrote to his neighbor. Dear Frank, we've been neighbors for 6 difficult years. When you borrowed my chainsaw, you returned it in pieces. When I was sick, you blasted rap music. When your dog went to the bathroom all over my lawn, you laughed. I could go on, but I'm certainly not one to hold grudges. So I'm writing this letter to tell you that your house is on fire. Cordially, Bob, See, that's what comes naturally to us, isn't it? To hang on to the hurt, to become bitter, and just wait for them to get what's coming to them. But listen to this warning from the Bible in Hebrews chapter 12. It says, see to it that no one misses the grace of God. And this is my prayer, my hope as a pastor, that nobody who calls this their church, that nobody who's a part of this community of believers would ever miss the powerful and beautiful truth of the grace of God. See to it that no one misses the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Because when we miss the power and the beauty of God's grace, then when something happens to offend us or to hurt us, bitterness begins to take root in our heart. It begins to trouble us. It begins to defile us, to mess us up emotionally and spiritually. So today we want to talk about resolving bitterness through the power of grace. Resolving hurt and injury and pain through the power of grace. So I want this to be very personal and practical. I don't want this to be theoretical today. So take that card that you have. If you're watching online, you can just draw your own. Just take that and write in that blank some kind of hurt, some kind of wound, some kind of offense that was brought into your life by someone else. Or it may not be just one thing. It may be a series of disappointments or offenses at the hands of another person that have been difficult for you to deal with. Because I don't want this to just be theory. I want this to be reality. And as I talk, I want you to write something in there. And then at the end of our time together, I want to walk you through a very simple exercise in forgiveness. Because forgiveness really is what we're talking about today. Forgiveness is really the most beautiful and powerful expression of grace in our relationships. So as we talk about grace, as we talk about forgiveness, as we talk about bitterness, I want to draw your attention to a passage in the Bible in the book of Ephesians, Ephesians chapter 4. Now, if you're new to the Bible, this is kind of toward the end of the Bible, and the book of Ephesians is actually a letter that was written to Christians living in the city of Ephesus. It's where the book gets its name, and it was a letter written in the first century by Paul. We know him today as the Apostle Paul. And Paul, if you know his story, he spent really the second half of his life traveling all over the world, taking the message of hope, the message of Christianity. And he was very passionate about this. But sometimes in his passion, he would run into a lot of opposition. There were multiple times when angry mobs would chase him out of a town. I mean, Paul almost lost his life multiple times. He ended up being arrested and thrown in prison. And I say that so that you understand that he was someone who understood how cruel people can be. He understood how difficult it can be to extend grace to others. And here in this letter that he writes to these Christians who were so new in their faith in the city of Ephesus there in the first century, in chapter 4, he begins this way in verse 1. He says, as a prisoner for the Lord. Remember, this was not written by a guy sitting in a hammock in the Bahamas. This was written by a guy sitting in prison. He understood injustice. He understood pain. As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. In other words, if you're a follower of Christ, if you're a Christian, at some point God called out to you. He captured your heart through a series of circumstances or people. He drew you to himself and made you his son or daughter. So what does it look like then to live up to that calling, to live up to that position? What does that mean exactly to live a life worthy of the calling you've received? Well, the rest of chapter 4, as Paul continues to write, he tells us exactly what it means to live a life worthy of the calling that we've received. We're going to just cover the last 7 verses in the chapter that talk about anger and bitterness and grace and forgiveness. So jump down to verse 26. Here's what it means. In your anger, he says, do not sin. Now, let me stop there and just point out the fact that it says, in your anger, do not sin. It does not say, it never says in the Bible, don't be angry. Because anger, in and of itself, is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, over 100 times in the Bible, God is described as being angry at something, and that may be unsettling for you. Some people say, I don't like the idea of a God who can be angry, but listen, if you never love anything, then you will never be angry. But if you love someone, then you will be angry at whatever it is that potentially causes harm to them. And so God's anger is always driven by his love for his people. And anger is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we need to be angry. I think we ought to be angry about the fact that there are elementary school kids in our community that don't have decent shoes to wear to school. Because if we take that righteous anger and channel it, we can actually find a solution to that. So anger in and of itself is not wrong. The key is to be angry for the right reasons, at the right time, in the right way, to the right degree, with the right people. So anger isn't necessarily wrong, but here's the thing. Anger can lead us to sin. And we can sin in our anger when our anger leads us to saying things and doing things that are destructive to the people around us and that grieve the heart of God. But Paul, as he writes this letter, he goes on to say how we can keep anger from turning into sin. He says this: do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. In other words, you just deal with it. Don't let anger settle into your heart and become bitterness. Don't take yesterday's anger and carry it into today. Don't take today's anger and carry it into tomorrow. Now, there's a very practical application of this. You probably heard marriage counselors or people talk about the fact that if you're married, you should never go to bed angry. Great advice. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry. It works really well unless you live in Alaska in the summer. Then you can stay angry for a long time because it's daylight, 24 hours. But other than that, it's a great principle. But I would suggest this principle in verse 26 is something that goes way beyond marriage relationships. Because the bigger idea here is that we need to make sure that we never allow anger to build up in our hearts. Because here's what can happen. When we allow the sun to go down on our anger, when we do that week after week, month after month, year after year, we just end up carrying our anger from one season of life into the next. And the anger that you felt as a child gets carried into adolescence. And the anger that you experienced in adolescence gets carried into adulthood. Then you carry that with you into your first marriage. And you carry the anger from your first marriage into your second marriage. And it just kind of blows up your life, and you end up becoming a very bitter person. And maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you know someone that there's just this anger that always exists beneath the surface of their lives, and you find yourself walking on eggshells around them. Or maybe you don't know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. You find yourself blowing up at the smallest things. Have you ever thought that maybe it's not about the thing in the moment that you're angry about, but it's what you've carried with you all of those years? Because I know people who carry anger with them for years, decades, even a lifetime. In fact, I have a brother who buys old houses and then fixes them up and then sells them. He flips houses. And years ago, he was cleaning out an old house that he had purchased, and he found a letter, and he gave it to me because he thought it would be a good sermon illustration. But there was this letter. It had a 6-cent postage stamp on it. And I did the research. That dates back to the mid-1960s. This letter was never mailed. The postage stamp was never canceled. It was still sealed. And on the back of the envelope, it said this: not to be mailed until after my funeral. Not to be mailed until after my funeral. Inside the envelope was a 7-page letter written from one woman to another, and it said, "Dear so-and-so," and then it gave all this long list of all these grievances, like dinner invitations that were refused, and slight insults, and money that was borrowed and not paid back on time. And then there are these statements in this 7-page letter that just drip with bitterness. Like it says, "Your mother must have had a bad time living with you. Enjoy yourself being mean like your grandfather." And this one, "I had you on my will, but after the treatment I got, I took you off. So you're the loser, not me." Signed, "A Letter from the Dead." And I read this thing and I thought, man, this is so tragic. Here's a person who carried their anger with them year after year after year, literally carried the anger with them to the grave. See, here's what happens. When we allow the sun to go down on our anger, here's what happens to us. We end up in our hearts giving, it says, the devil a foothold. And the word foothold is a climbing term. A foothold is what allows a climber to scale a rock face that would otherwise be impossible to climb. And the idea here is this: when you hang on to that hurt, when you hang on to that bitterness, you create the opportunity for the evil one to gain traction in your heart, to gain influence in your life, to destroy not the person you're angry at, but to destroy yourself. I love the way Anne Lamott says it. She said this: refusing to forgive someone is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. It only harms you. So Paul continues writing. Let's pick up in verse 29. He goes on to say this, not talking about our hearts now, but talking about our words which flow out of our hearts. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Because one of the clearest manifestations of an unforgiving spirit is when we use words like weapons to destroy other people, either to their face or behind their back. And not only do those unwholesome words harm the other person, they harm us as well, because as we speak them, they reinforce the anger in our hearts. They cement it even deeper. It affects us emotionally, but even those unwholesome words and that bitterness, it affects us spiritually, because verse 30 goes on to say this, and do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. In other words, an unforgiving spirit that manifests itself in those unwholesome words will actually create distance between you and the God who created you. So what do you do about all this? How do you respond to all this? Well, you come to verse 31, and it tells us how to deal with the hurt, the pain, the offense, the anger in our hearts. And Paul, as he writes this, he says something here that may seem simplistic on the surface. He says something here that may seem very unsympathetic and insensitive, especially if you've had some deep wound in your life. He says this, he just says, just get rid of it. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling, and slander, along with every form of malice. And malice simply means a general negative feeling that you have toward another person. Now, you may read that, and you may say, oh, come on, Mark. Just get rid of it. I mean, you make it sound so simple, like you do not understand what she did to me. You don't understand the pain he brought into my life. You don't understand how difficult this is for me. Get rid of it? What do you mean just get rid of it? Well, the answer is found if you keep reading in verse 32. It goes on to say this, be kind and compassionate to one another. And here's how you get rid of it. Forgiving each other. And in the original Greek language of the New Testament of the Bible, the sentence structure here in verse 32 is such that it implies that forgiveness is the means by which we get rid of the bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, slander, and malice. That forgiveness is what breaks the power of bitterness. In fact, forgiveness is the only thing that can break the power of our anger and our bitterness. Now, I want to talk about forgiveness, and I know that whenever we talk about the subject of forgiveness, it raises a lot of questions. There's a lot of misunderstanding. So I want to make sure that we have clarity on what it means to forgive someone and what it does not mean to forgive. I want to tell you 6 things that forgiveness is not. Okay, number 1 is this: forgiveness is not a feeling. Because I'll talk to people who say, I just don't feel like I can forgive that person. Good news, you don't have to feel it. God never commands us to feel anything. He commands us to choose to do certain things. And you can't force yourself to feel something. You can't. But you can choose to do something. You can choose to forgive. Here's how I would say it. I would say it this way, that forgiveness is a servant of the will. It's not a prisoner of the emotions. That real forgiveness is simply making the choice to let go of the hurt, even when you don't feel like it, even when your emotions are telling you not to forgive. Forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a choice. In fact, let me tell you specifically what it means when you say to another person, I forgive you. What you're saying is that you're promising to do 3 things. Number 1, I won't bring this matter up to you. Number 2, I won't bring this matter up to others. Number 3, I won't dwell on this myself. Those are the 3 promises of forgiveness. Number 1, I won't bring this matter up to you. In other words, I won't remind you of what you've done and use it as leverage to manipulate you, to shame you, to control you. I'm not going to keep beating you over the head with this. It's like the guy who said, whenever I get into an argument with my wife, she gets historical. And I said, hysterical? He said, no, I mean historical. She brings up everything I've ever done in the past. Now, this doesn't mean it's wrong to have a healthy discussion about issues in the relationship. The idea here is that you're not going to use that as ammunition anymore. You're not going to keep bringing it up and beating the other person over the head with it. Number 2, I won't bring this matter up to others. In other words, I'm not going to keep telling my sad story about what you did to everybody who will listen, because that just reinforces it in my own heart. And again, you can't be legalistic about that. Sometimes it's good to sit down with a counselor and unpack the hurts and issues in your life. But the idea here is that you're not going to keep telling all your friends about how bad that person is and what they did to you. And then number 3, and this is the most difficult one, I think, I won't dwell on this myself. Because it's one thing to say, I won't talk about this anymore. It's another thing entirely to decide you're not going to let your thoughts go there and stay there. But here's the thing. The only way to free yourself from the pain of the past, the only way to free yourself from the bitterness in your heart is to promise and keep the promise to do these 3 things. When I was a kid, every once in a while I would cut myself or I would scratch myself. And if it was bad enough, I would go in the house and my mom would take care of the injury. In fact, she would put this stuff on it. I don't know if you remember this, but it was called Bactine. Do you remember Bactine? It's like 90% alcohol, 10% salt. Like it stung, but it cleaned out the wound. And then my mom would say something like this, now leave it alone, because if you keep scratching at it, it's never going to heal. And what's true with physical injuries is true with emotional injuries as well. If you keep scratching at it, if you keep opening up the subject, your heart is never going to heal. The relationship is never going to heal. That's why forgiveness is not a feeling. Forgiveness is a choice. It's a promise to do 3 things. Number 2, forgiveness is not forgetting. Because we have a phrase that we use. We say, oh, you just need to forgive and forget. Which sounds good, but it's actually impossible because you cannot force yourself to forget anything. You can't. And if the wound is deep enough, you may remember that event for the rest of your life. And sometimes people point to, the words in the book of Jeremiah in the Bible where God says, I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. That doesn't mean that God forgets about our wrongdoing because he's God. He can't forget. He is what we call omniscient. God never says, man, I just can't remember what I did last Thursday. What was last Thursday? I can't remember. He's God. He doesn't forget. What it means is this. When it says God remembers our sin no more, it means he doesn't hold those things against us. It means that your past is irrelevant to the way he sees you. He doesn't count those things against you. That's what we do when we forgive it. It doesn't mean we can necessarily forget, but it does mean that we don't hold it against that person. Now, let me say this. Truly forgiving is the pathway toward forgetting. Because when you decide you're not going to bring that up to the other person, not going to bring that up to other people, you're not going to dwell on it yourself, eventually the memory and the emotion connected to that begins to fade. It's almost like a bell in a bell tower with a long rope. As long as you keep pulling the rope, the bell's going to ring. But when you let go of that rope, the momentum of the bell will continue to make it ring, but eventually it will slow and fade and stop ringing. It's the same thing with forgiving. Eventually the memory will fade. Number 3, forgiveness is not earned. True forgiveness doesn't mean waiting for the other person to change or to make restitution or even to apologize. You can choose to forgive even if the other person doesn't earn it or even ask for it. Do you remember when Jesus was crucified? In his dying moments, he spoke 7 statements. One of them was a statement of forgiveness. He prayed, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. They didn't earn that forgiveness. They didn't ask for it. But Jesus said, please, God, forgive them. Number 4, and this is kind of parallel to that, forgiveness is not blind trust. So there's a big difference between forgiveness and trust. Forgiveness is given, trust is earned. And forgiveness doesn't mean that you ignore a clear track record of behavior. Like if somebody you know has a track record of breaking every promise they make, you forgive them, but you're a little bit more careful about trusting their promises in the future. Forgiveness is given, trust has to be earned. So forgiveness is not blind trust. Now, listen, if you're in a relationship with somebody, especially women, somebody who abuses you, get out of that relationship. You can forgive them later after they're in jail, okay? For now, get out of the relationship because forgiveness is not blind trust. Number 5, forgiveness is not excusing. Forgiveness does not necessarily erase consequences. There are times when consequences still exist, even when forgiveness has been granted. Like suppose you have a teenage son, and he comes home one day and tells you he just got a speeding ticket. And he says, Dad, I'm so sorry. I know I should have been paying more attention. I know I should have been watching my speed, but I didn't. Now I got a ticket. Dad, will you forgive me? And as a good father, you say, yes, son, I forgive you. And then he hands you the ticket and he says, thanks so much for taking care of this. And he walks away. And as a good father, you don't pay the speeding ticket. You allow your son, because you love your son, to feel the full weight of the consequences so he will learn from it. Because forgiveness does not mean excusing something. And then number 6, perhaps most importantly, forgiveness is not easy. It isn't. It seems easy when you're in church and there's a guy up front talking about it. But when you actually have to forgive somebody, you discover it's not easy, especially if the wound is deep. And I think in some cases it's humanly impossible to forgive someone. Only God can give us the strength to forgive someone. And we ask him for that strength. But forgiveness is not easy, but it is possible. And here's why it's possible. Because you come to the very last verse in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, and it says this: be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. I think those two words, just as, they ought to be highlighted, underlined, and in bold font in every printed copy of the Bible. Because that's the key right there. Those two words make all the difference. The message of the gospel is this: when we were the enemies of God, by his grace, he stepped into human history and went to a Roman cross and left behind an empty tomb so that we could be forgiven and made his sons and daughters. And so what we do is we just pass on what we have received. That grace should not only flow into our hearts, it should flow through our hearts. And so we recognize how deeply we have been forgiven, and then we pass that forgiveness on to other people. The famous Dutch painter Rembrandt in the 1600s, he did a painting called The Raising of the Cross. And it's a very, very interesting painting, primarily because he painted himself into the center of the canvas. He put his own self-portrait in there, even wearing his modern-day clothing, suggesting that he, 1,600 years after the crucifixion, was as responsible for it as the Roman soldiers were that day. It was a theological statement that Jesus had to die for his sin, for his failure, for his mistakes as well. You know what I need to do all the time? I have to see myself at the cross. Because when I see myself at the cross, it melts my anger. It takes away my pride. It humbles me. It softens my heart toward the people who have offended me. And if you're a follower of Christ and you have a hard time forgiving other people, I'll tell you why that is. You've either never really understood or you have forgotten what it meant for God to forgive you and give you his grace. And when I find it hard to forgive other people, it's because here's what I'm doing. I'm focusing on what was done to me rather than what was done for me. And so the way to deal with the pain is you go back to a bloodstained cross and you remind yourself that even when you did not deserve grace and forgiveness, it was poured out into you. So here's the bottom line. Grace is greater than my pain. And I don't know what that pain is in your life. It's probably greater than the pain in my life because I honestly, I'm in the junior varsity when it comes to pain. Many of you have struggled far more deeply than I have, but I want to tell you this: whatever that pain is that someone else has brought into your life, God's grace in your heart and living through you is greater than that. So what do you do about that? What do you do with a message like this? Let me go back to verse 31. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling, and slander, along with every form of malice. Get rid of it. So I want to give you a chance to do that today. So take that card that you have, get that out in front of you again. If you didn't write anything in that blank, I want you to give that some thought in the next 2 minutes and write something in there that would be very personal to your story. Or just if you want to write generically, my pain, grace is greater than my pain, that's okay too. Because I'm going to give you the opportunity in just a few minutes to leave that card here, to let it go, to literally throw it away. Because in the words of Elsa, sometimes you just got to let it go, okay? So here's what's going to happen in the next few minutes. After I get done talking in just a minute, I want to show you a video. This is part of a recent news story just a compelling story of grace in the face of very deep pain. A video testimony in a courtroom. And then after that video, the band is going to come back. We're going to sing one more song. And during that song, what we're going to do is this. The ushers are going to come, and they're actually going to roll trash cans down all the aisles, literal trash cans. And I want you to take that card, and I want you to pass it to the aisles. You can turn it over, maybe even fold it in half if it's very, very personal. And then if you're on that end seat, you just take those cards, and when the trash can comes by, just throw them in the trash can. This is a symbolic way of saying, I'm releasing this. I'm letting this go. I'm leaving this here. Whatever's on this card, I'm choosing to forgive.